Hello future, this pile of garbage right here is, or should I say, used to be a Toshiba Libretto 50CT, one of the two I have. Both hailing from Japan, and unfortunately, like a postal worker on leave, both wouldn't post. A total bummer because not only is the Libretto 50CT one of the coolest retro computers ever made, but growing up I was crazy about tiny handheld PCs, and the idea of owning a tiny Pentium laptop that I could have only dreamed of when I was a kid is just incredible. So in this part of the Eric experiment, we're gonna see how I ended up with this pile of electronic parts and broken plastic. Oh, and a totally working Libretto. So let's go, let's do it, let's just do it. Back in the 90s and early 2000s, I was fascinated by handheld PCs, palm tops, or whatever you call those things. You know, stuff like the HP Jornadas, NEC Mobile Pros, Cassiopeias, and Scions. I used to see them in magazines and dream about having one. And whenever I saw one in person, I'd be asking the owner if I could play with it. Often unsuccessfully because no one really wants a kid playing with their very expensive electronics, right? Windows CE was definitely a big factor in my fascination, especially because you couldn't use that on normal x86 computers. But if you told me 97, the year this thing was launched outside Japan, that I could have a full-blown desktop Pentium 75MHz processor running real Windows 95 on a tiny form factor like that, I would have been like, no way! And I was still like, what? When I learned about the Toshiba Libretto 50CT a few years ago. I love the idea of being able to use tiny retro PCs that are as authentic as possible. If you watch my Tiny 486 computer build video, you'll definitely know that. And the idea of having a laptop version of that is just so cool. So I imported one from Japan as that was cheaper than on eBay. Oh, hi Maple, are you also curious about this computer or you just want to be cute but inconvenient? But anyway, as I mentioned in the intro, this thing wasn't posting. After a little research, I found an article that mentioned that apparently you can press the escape key while turning the laptop on to get in the BIOS, which I tried, but still nothing happened. Then I found this Reddit post where some of the answers said something that seemed kinda dumb to me. Apparently the Libretto won't post and you can't even get in the BIOS without a functioning and compatible hard drive. Oh hi Monshao, are you curious about this laptop too? Yes, it is tiny! Sure, just walk on it, knock yourself out. Anyways, after a bit more worldwide webbing, I found a VOGONS post where I learned that the laptop has a BIOS flashing mode that can be accessed by pressing F12 while turning the thing on regardless of having a hard drive or not. Don't mind the image right now looking like UFO sighting footage from the 70s, I really had to crank up the ISO here because this display is a bit too dim against my studio lights. But here we go, ready for BIOS update, place the BIOS update diskette, blah blah blah. I guess this at least tells me this thing is not completely dead. But like, before learning about the F12 thing, I actually imported another one of these guys from Japan. And it's the same story, plug it in, turn it on, and nothing. And with this one, F12 would just get it to beep in an interval most of the time, with the BIOS update message coming up every few tries. Yeah, this guy here seems to be in even worse shape than the other one, so I'll try a few things on the other one initially. First, a 60GB Toshiba hard drive that might be too big for this laptop, as it originally came with an 810MB hard drive. Then if that doesn't work, I'll try this SD to IDE adapter, which might not work because it's not an actual hard drive. And then, finally, a CF card to IDE adapter with two different 2GB CF cards, which I think have the highest chance of working because they aren't too big and CF cards can use the IDE protocol. So let's get started with removing the little lid that covers the hard drive compartment by removing these two screws. And this is where I did my first mistake. Inserting the hard drive was a bit hard because this one is a bit thicker than the original, and that should have been a huge red flag, but I didn't think too much of it and applied a bit too much force because the computer is made of plastic and plastic usually has some flexibility, right? Well, not 90s plastic, which after nearly 30 years has the same flexibility of an eggshell. So like me, you'll basically see the aftermath later, but I basically broke some of the screw standoffs that hold the case together. Anyway, let's see what happens when we try to turn this thing on with the hard drive drive in. And like the postal worker coming back to work on Monday, it posts. I'm too proud of this joke. This is incredible. Okay, little confession. This footage is actually from the second time I turned it on because the first time, the screen visibility was like the fine print in a multi-level marketing contract. Not visible at all. The first time I had to press F1 to get in the BIOS because the CMOS battery was dead, but this time it went straight into trying to boot Windows because I left the power cable connected. I'm so glad this works, but I think it's really stupid this laptop needs a hard drive to post at all, because being able to post without a hard drive is really useful for diagnostics or if you need to boot from a floppy disk or something. I can't even imagine how many good librettos went to e-waste just because their hard drives died. I prefer not to think about it. Just for peace of mind, I tried the hard drive on the other libretto, even though it doesn't even turn on with F12 pressed most of the time. And this time I had the presence of mind of loosening the screws on the bottom before shoving the hard drive in. But yeah, no luck. No matter how many times I tried, this thing would not boot up. Coming back the next day, I wanted to check if I could boot up the working libretto with the SD card and the CF cards. And here's where I finally noticed how bad the hard drive shoving mangled the case. Just listen to this noise. Ouch. Well, there's nothing we can do here but to keep disassembling this thing so we can test the other stuff. But beware, given the situation we're in, this is gonna be a carnage. So viewer discretion's advised.
Violent destruction, radar blasted in my head, disintegration, pulverization, 30 years of decay, dead of the forest, no return, technological slaughter, little laptop has seen better days, see you in hell.
Well, at least I can finally test the SD and CF cards, but not before a little pause to contemplate my life choices. Anyway, let's put this 16GB SD card in and see what happens. It works! It's trying to boot the OS2 Warp 4 that I installed on the Tiny 46. That's awesome! It's great that the SD card is an option, but I still want to try the CF card since we're already here. Oh, it doesn't fit. The adapter board won't go in flat because the connector is too close to the motherboard, and the IDE solder points on the adapter protrude from the board. But that's okay, we can use the SD card and that's great. Before we do anything else though, I want to try one last thing on the other libretto. I bought this PCM-CIA Toshiba floppy drive and I want to see if I can fix the laptop by reflashing the BIOS. To do that, we need to create a floppy disk with the update utilities. I won't go into too much detail on that, but that was a little nightmare in itself. Basically, I didn't have a retro computer with a floppy drive ready to go, so after downloading the Libretto 50CT files from VOGONS, I had to use a USB floppy drive on my Windows 11 computer, and after various failed attempts of trying to write directly to the floppy drive, I managed to write an image attached to an emulated computer with Windows 98 on PCEM. Then I tried to use WinImage on my desktop to write the image to a floppy disk, which I couldn't because the WinImage trial had expired. So I had to install WinImage on a Windows XP virtual machine, pass the USB floppy drive through to it, and then finally write the image to the disk. That was a pain in the ass and I probably could have gotten my Pentium MMX connected in less time, but I did manage to write the BIOS flashing software to the floppy disk, so it doesn't matter. Now it was just a matter of putting the floppy disk in and trying to get into the BIOS flashing screen by pressing F12 while turning the thing on, which I managed to do after like 5 billion tries. And sadly, all of that was for nothing. The floppy disk kept spinning with the LED indicator on forever. So my Hail Mary was to try to go into the BIOS flashing screen with no floppy disk in, and then when in that screen, I inserted the disk and pressed enter. But still no luck. So I decided that my only option to have a working libretto at this point is to Frankenstein both of them together, using the good shell from the one that doesn't work and the guts from the one that does. So I started disassembling this one, this time with the help from an iFixit guide on how to tear down the Libretto 50CT so I don't risk committing manslaughter on the good case I have. Who would have thought that iFixit would have a teardown guide on such an old computer? That's pretty cool. And with the guide, I learned I needed to remove this cover above the keyboard to reveal a screw that releases the keyboard and allows the easy removal of the bottom of the shell. That's why I was struggling to do that on the other libretto. If like me you don't have plastic spudgers to pry stuff open, a thin guitar pick is always a good replacement. Now I can remove the keyboard without turning the shell into dust. And look at this! This guy has a memory expansion module. I really hope it's working and we'll be testing it soon, so let's just keep going for now. After removing the bottom of the shell, I can finally disconnect the LCD flat cable and remove the motherboard. Okay, in order to separate the lid from the top part of the shell, I need to remove the front bezel of the LCD. To do that, I need to remove these ticker thingies here to reveal some screws. Then I can remove the track point rubber thing. As you can see, I'm really good with my terminology. And with the soft guitar pick, I can try to pry the front bezel open, which regardless of how careful I am, will have a bunch of the plastic tabs that hold the front and the back of the LCD assembly together broken because, you know, 90s plastic. Of course I broke the top of the bezel while trying to pry it open. I later realized that I could have just lifted the bezel bottom first and the top would have come right off, but it's too late now. Luckily, the same part from the other laptop is intact. For now. After unscrewing the left hinge from the lid, I need to remove the flat cable from the top of the shell so I can separate them. So of course I started unnecessarily disassembling the whole screen area for no reason, until I realized that I could just use the lid from the other laptop instead of transplanting it. I'm definitely an experienced professional working here. To actually separate the two parts, I need to remove this tape from the hinge area and remove this plastic lid thingy. And here's the top of the shell completely intact. Let's be careful and try to keep it this way. Now let's go back to the working laptop so I can finish extracting its guts. And I finally removed the keyboard the proper way. And as you can see here, this one doesn't have a memory expansion module, which means I can use the one I found in the other Libretto assuming it's working. Now the rest here is pretty much the same as the other one. Again, breaking the tabs that hold the front and the back of the lid together is unavoidable as the plastic is more fragile than a billionaire's ego. But this time the front came out pretty much intact, for now. And here we go, we can now use this monitor in the final assembly. Alright, now it's time to test that memory module we found in the other Libretto, so let's connect it to the motherboard. The laptop posts! It looks like it's a 16 megabyte module, bringing the total RAM to 32 megabytes. Amazing! Now we can finally start assembling a working Libretto, which I'll go through the process quickly as it's just the opposite of the disassembly process. Now check this out. Yep, I put too much pressure when reinstalling it and ended up cracking it. Now with two broken LCD bezels, I just glued this one back together with super glue off camera. I was thinking of trying to design and 3D print a new front bezel for this thing, but that seemed like a lot of extra work for a project that is already taking way too long, so maybe another time. Now it's time to try to put it on again, top first, being way more careful this time. Alright, before continuing this, I'll remove the SD card to prepare it before closing the laptop with it inside. I didn't bother to film that, but basically I used the Tiny486 computer to create two partitions on the SD card. The primary one where we're gonna install Windows 95, which I made bootable by using a Windows 98 boot disk, and the second one which I copied the Windows 95 installation files to. After that, we can reinsert the SD card into the adapter, and just in case I put some Kapton tape on it to make sure it doesn't come out. Now we can finish assembling it. Now, when I removed the adhesives that cover the screws on the LCD assembly, they pretty much lost their adhesiveness, and they also don't stay straight anymore because of the force of pulling them out. So I'm gonna try putting some double-sided tape and leave some weight on them overnight to see if I can stick them back where they belong. It's clearly not very good. Oh well. And that's pretty much it. Now look at the aftermath of all of this. Hopefully I can do something with these parts one day. Let's just put it all in a container before going any further. And here's the Toshiba Libretto 50CT fully assembled. Now we can finally take this thing for a spin, and we are going to start by installing Windows 95. After turning the laptop on, we get this warning, can't restore hibernated state. And after pressing enter, we get this bad RTC battery message, which is what I saw the first time I turned on the laptop with a 60GB hard drive. This is expected because I didn't replace the CMOS battery. We just need to leave the BIOS and we can boot it with the SD card, which was made bootable with a Windows 98 boot disk as I mentioned earlier. And from here on out, it's just a standard Windows 95 install, which we have seen 500 kajillion times, so I'll just speed this up. I'm skipping the network setup here because at this point I still didn't have a PCMCIA network card or a dock with a serial port to connect to modem. I tried to find the Japanese keyboard layout here because this is a Japanese keyboard, but there's none, so I'll just use a standard English one for now. I had this Microsoft Real Mode Drive Space Driver DLL conflict for some reason. I just kept the newer one. Now we're ready to boot Windows 95 for the first time and finish the setup. And that's it. Now we need to install the Toshiba drivers and other software that I'll use on this thing, which I'll do off camera. Now we can finally boot into Windows 95 with all of the drivers and everything that I want to show installed. But before we continue, I need to play my customary post-Windows install solitaire game. And done. Another thing I need to say before we continue, I really love 90s LCD displays like this one. I love the way the color shifts when you look at them at certain angles. Unlike modern cheap LCDs, they still feel high quality but with outdated technology from an earlier era. They still give me a futuristic feel with nostalgia and excitement. I remember seeing old handheld PCs from the 90s displaying the Windows desktop with the Internet Explorer logo and feeling that excitement, especially with the possibility of going online on them. While modern LCDs and now OLED displays are technologically superior, they don't trigger those feelings. But anyway, tangent over. Let's start this by checking out CPU-Z. And here we can confirm what we already knew. This is a Pentium 1 running at 75 MHz. Here in the memory tab we can see that we have 32 MB of RAM installed, which is double of what this computer used to ship with because of that extra memory we found in the other Libretto. There's not much more information here, so let's move on to trying some games. And the first one we'll try is Sim Tower. This is one of my favorite games of all time. So many hours I have spent building towers on this. I love the 256 color graphics with dithering, and this laptop can run it fairly well with minimal audio stuttering. Sim Tower might be my favorite Maxis game, but of course there are other amazing ones, one of them being SimCity 2000. The gameplay is okay on this Libretto, but aside from the startup screen, there's no audio in-game on this device for some reason. Aside from that, I wish it ran a bit faster, but it's still playable, so I'm pretty happy with it. Next up, we'll try the Windows 95 version of my favorite game of all time, Lemmings. It runs perfectly. I do prefer the DOS version though, especially because of the music. I don't know if it's because of the sound card on this computer, but I prefer how the DOS version sounds. Maybe it's because I've been playing that game with Sound Blaster 16s my whole life. Or maybe it's because it was that version that I grew up with. It's still Lemmings though, so I'm not gonna complain. There are thousands of other games I could test here, and there are plenty of other videos showing Librettos running games. So I want to move on to something that this computer would have been used for a lot when it was current. I have installed Microsoft Office 95, and this is Microsoft Word. Hell yeah! I imagine people who bought this thing for business purposes would take a while to adapt to this keyboard because the keys are pretty small, and it's especially hard to type on it with the camera right in front of me. What else to say though besides, indeed this is Microsoft Word. Another super exciting program we can check out is Microsoft Excel. And here's a little AutoSum for you. Legit, for 90% of use cases you could totally still use these versions of Word and Excel because their core functionality hasn't changed in nearly 30 years. Now Microsoft Office is cool and all, but let's move on to what we're really here for. Here's a Xircom 16-bit PCMCIA Ethernet card that we'll use to get this thing online. I have already installed the drivers so we can go straight into Netscape. It's so crazy that on a Windows 95 computer I didn't have to restart the computer after connecting the card, and we're already online. So let's visit a few websites, the first one being the Toshiba one from 1998. To do this, I'm using a slightly modified version of the Wayback Proxy available on GitHub running on my NAS because, sadly, the old net has been having some issues with the Internet Archive blocking it, as they reduced the request quotas. I wanted to get to the Libretto product page, but it seems that this section of the website hasn't been archived correctly. So let's move on to another big name from the 90s, Lycos. It's just the ad that hasn't loaded in this case, the rest seems fine, especially because this page is not very image heavy. The Libretto is doing a pretty good job at running Netscape and loading these websites. We can also browse a few GeoCity sites. Here are a couple of cool ones I found on Alta Vista, like the Bianca's Pokemon site, a cool Pokemon fan page from the 90s. I also found this cool dinosaur one, the official Dinoland website with a lot of information about various dinosaurs, interviews, images, and so on. This is my kind of website. Aside from browsing cool websites from the past, one last thing I want to show is how having a network connection allows us to very easily transfer files to the computer using a piece of software like WSFTP. I can connect to my NAS using it, browse to a folder with files that I want, and then quickly transfer files to a local folder. This makes life so much easier as I can just go into the abandonware folder on my server to get any software that I might want to run on this or any of my retro computers. And there you have it. Getting this laptop up and running wasn't without its trials, especially when I accidentally broke the front bezel of the screen. And sadly, this thing will never have the same structural integrity it used to because of the nature of 90s plastics. But in the end, I think we got a pretty decent result and I'm really happy with it. Regardless of anything, it was a cool project to work on, and it's amazing to have such a tiny retro laptop that I would have only been able to dream of having when I was a kid. Now, I want to acknowledge that it took me many months to finish this video, which is a bit of a bummer, and I'd love to say that I'll be uploading more frequently in 2024, but I won't make any promises so people who enjoy these videos don't get disappointed. What I can say though is that I have plenty of other great projects and video ideas for the future, so if you enjoyed this video and like content about retro computing, retro gaming, and other tangentially related subjects, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future uploads when they do come out. Also, make sure to join my Discord server so you can chat with other people who enjoy the projects under the Eric Experiment umbrella. I do show up there every now and then too. I also have a little shop with Alta Vista merch and a Patreon. I don't make a big fuss about them, but if you feel inclined to check them out, it could eventually help a lot with paying for stuff related to the projects and maybe eventually allow me to dedicate more time to these projects. But that's it for now. Thanks for watching.